Hi, we're having a conversation with Dr. Eric Daniels. He is Research Assistant Professor at the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. Dr. Daniels, are all political systems born equal?
No, I think that we have to take an approach to political systems when we understand comparative politics that evaluates a political system based upon a very important characteristic. And that is the characteristic of how well or how dedicated a political system is to protecting individual rights. Not every political system does this. Different political systems have different respect and different amounts of respect for individual rights. But if we're going to evaluate political systems, we have to say some are better than others. And the criteria by which we say that is whether or not that political system protects individual rights and upholds individual rights of the citizens in that nation.
You stress on individual rights, but what about the group, the city, the nation?
Well, those are all essentially components of that they're made up of individuals. That the influence of any group of individuals, of a city, of a county, of a state, or even a whole nation, is really fundamentally only about those individuals that make up that system. That to speak of something like the common good or the good of the city is really to speak of something that is good for each of the individuals in that system, good for them as individuals, not as a collective. Because to say that something is good for the group outside of what's good for the individuals would mean that some of the individuals in that group would have to sacrifice their interests or sacrifice their rights or sacrifice some of their income or their freedom in order to satisfy the needs and desires of the group. The only thing that we can really say that is truly the common good is the good of each individual in a system or in a group.
And isn't sacrifice needed in order to live in society? Don't you have to renounce to something?
Well, that's commonly a formulation that people have, that you have to give up certain freedoms in order to guarantee your rights. But what you're giving up, or what's being talked about, if we give that a generous interpretation, if we allow that people have a good motive behind that question, it's not actually a sacrifice. It's not something that people are giving up. What they're doing is they're transferring a certain power. They're transferring a certain aspect of a social system. They're transferring in a legitimate social system, in a legitimate political system. What they're transferring is the means of using retaliatory force against criminals or against foreign invaders, against other people who violate their rights. They're not actually giving up any of their freedom. Freedom basically means who is in control of your choices. Is it you? Are you ultimately the authority over yourself in terms of the choices and actions that you take? Or is someone else telling you? And you're not actually giving that up. You're only giving up the power of enforcing against people who violate that right, who try to compel you or try to act against you. You're transferring the right of adjudicating and punishing violators of that. So in a sense, when people say, oh, you're giving up something in order to live in society, you're not giving anything up in terms of your freedom. What you're doing is you're simply making objective the power of enforcing the rules of that society, of preserving your freedom. And so it's not really a giving up as much as it is a delegation of authority of a certain aspect of protecting individual rights.
And some people think that in order to exercise rights, you need to fulfill certain obligations.
Right.
What are those obligations?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because there is one sense in which the phrase usually is rights imply obligations. And I think that there's only one legitimate sense of that phrase. Typically people say the right implies the obligation of giving to charity or being taxed or not engaging in certain business activities. And therefore you have a right to do other things with that obligation. The real obligation is actually a negative obligation, not a positive obligation. Having rights implies no positive action on your part. It simply asks you negatively to leave other people alone, to leave them free to enjoy their rights. And so in one sense we can say rights imply the obligation not to interfere with others in the exercise of their rights. But that's it. There's no obligation to give, there's no obligation to sacrifice some of your values, there's no obligation to work for others, there's no positive obligation. There's simply the negative obligation, don't interfere. And deal with people on voluntary basis. If they want to deal with you, if you want to engage in business, if you want to become friends, That's entirely up to both of you to decide. Don't force anyone. That's the only obligation, really, that a right implies, if we want to put it in those terms.
And you have mentioned values. What is the role of values in this matter of obligations and rights and the role of the political system?
Well, a political system ultimately is based upon the values and the recognition that the values of the individuals within that system have to be accomplished by those individuals. That the productivity, the wealth in the society, that the material things, the spiritual values, the friendships, the arts, the culture that a society creates is ultimately an individual thing. And the values in terms of the political system have to be left to the people to decide. The great mistake of many political systems today is to assume that values are either out there in the world and that we can force other people to accept them, even if they don't know it, even if they're wrong. This is the idea, but it's better for you. I know what's good for you. Or, on the other hand, the other mistake is the idea that there is no such thing as values. We just all do what we want, and that we can all just sort of feel whatever we want, and whatever we want to be of value to us can be of value to us. Under a system of individual rights, under capitalism, what you have is a system where values are objective. If you want a value, if you want to pursue a value, you're free to do so. And thus, if the market, for example, wants to pay baseball players 5 times, 10 times, 100 times as much as it pays engineers, it doesn't mean somehow that that is more intrinsically valuable. It simply means that in a free society, the individuals who patronize baseball, for example, are more interested in paying for that than they are in paying for engineering. Now, an intrinsicist would come along and say, no, engineering is more important, and baseball is just an amusement. Therefore, the baseball player has a salary of only this, and the engineer makes that. Well, no, that's not freedom. The freedom of a market and values, and in a political system that respects rights, is that it's the right of each individual to determine what are his values and how to pursue them and to what extent. I may value baseball a little bit and engineering a lot. Another individual may value baseball a lot and engineering a little. And under a system of individual rights, we both have the freedom to decide how to choose and allocate our time and energy toward those values. And so that's really what makes them objective. That what happens in a free society, in a capitalist society, is that the values are determined by the people who are making those choices, not by the government, not by anyone imposing them from outside, whether because they think that they know better than you, or whether it's because that's just the way they feel about those values. In such a system, the values are ultimately rooted in the individuals that are choosing to pursue those values.
Well, thank you, Dr. Daniels, for sharing these ideas with us, and thank you very much.